The Gift of Therapy, Chapter 16, Using the Here and Now, Grow Rabbit Ears. One of the first steps in therapy is to identify the here and now equivalents of your patient's interpersonal problems. An essential part of your education is to learn to focus on the here and now. You must develop here and now rabbit ears. The everyday events of each therapy hour are rich with data. Consider how patients greet you, take a seat, inspect or fail to inspect their surroundings, begin and end the session, recount their history, and relate to you. My office is in a separate cottage about 100 feet down a winding garden path from my house. Since every patient walks down the same path, I have over the years accumulated much comparison data. Most patients comment about the garden, the profusion of fleecy lavender blossoms, the sweet, heavy wisteria fragrance, the riot of purple, pink, coral, and crimson, but some do not. One man never failed to make some negative comment. The mud on the path, the need for guardrails in the rain, or the sound of leaf blowers from a neighboring house. I give all patients the same directions to my office for their first visit. Drive down X Street a half-mile past XX Road, make a right turn at XXX Avenue, at which there's a sign for Fresca, a local attractive restaurant on the corner. Some patients comment on the directions, some do not. One particular patient, the same one who complained about the muddy path, confronted me in an early session. How come you chose Fresca as your landmark rather than Taco Tio? Taco Tio is a Mexican fast food eyesore on the opposite corner. To grow rabbit ears, keep in mind this principle: one stimulus, many reactions. If individuals are exposed to a common complex stimulus, they are likely to have very different responses. This phenomenon is particularly evident in group therapy, in which group members simultaneously experience the same stimulus. For example, a member's weeping, or late arrival, or confrontation with the therapist. And yet, each of them has a very different response to the event. Why does that happen? There is only one possible explanation. Each individual has a different internal world, and the stimulus has a different meaning to each. In individual therapy, the same principle obtains, only the events occur sequentially rather than simultaneously. That is, many patients of one therapist are, over time, exposed to the same stimulus. Therapy is like a living Rorschach test. Patients project onto it perceptions, attitudes, and meanings from their own unconscious. I develop certain baseline expectations because all my patients encounter the same person, assuming I am reasonably stable, receive the same directions to my office, walk down the same path to get there, enter the same room with the same furnishings. Thus, the patient's idiosyncratic response is deeply informative, a via regia permitting you to understand the patient's inner world. When the latch on my screen door was broken, preventing the door from closing snugly, my patients responded in a number of ways. One patient invariably spent much time fiddling with it and each week apologized for it as though she had broken it. Many ignored it, while others never failed to point out the defect and suggest I should get it fixed. Some wondered why I delayed so long. Even the banal Kleenex box may be a rich source of data. One patient apologized if she moved the box slightly when extracting a tissue. Another refused to take the last tissue in the box. Another wouldn't let me hand her one, saying she could do it herself. Once, when I had failed to replace an empty box, a patient joked about it for weeks. "So you remembered this time." Or, "A new box, you must be expecting a heavy session today." Another brought me a present of 2 boxes of Kleenex. Most of my patients have read some of my books, and their responses to my writing constitute a rich source of material. Some are intimidated by my having written so much. Some express concern that they will not prove interesting to me. One patient told me that he had read a book of mine in snatches in the bookstore and didn't want to buy it since he had, quote unquote, already given a donation at the office. Others who make the assumption of an economy of scarcity hate the books because my descriptions of close relationships to other patients suggest that there will be little love left for them. In addition to responses to office surroundings, therapists have a variety of other standard reference points. For example, beginnings and endings of hours, bill payments that generate comparative data. And then, of course, there is that most elegant and complex instrument of all, the Stradivarius of psychotherapy practice, the therapist's own self. I shall have much more to say about the use and care of this instrument. Chapter 17. Search for here and now equivalents. What should the therapist do when a patient brings up an issue involving some unhappy interaction with another person? Generally, therapists explore the situation at great depth and try to help the patient understand his or her role in the transaction, explore options for alternative behaviors, investigate unconscious motivation, guess at the motivations of the other person, and search for patterns, that is, similar situations that the patient has created in the past. This time-honored strategy has limitations. Not only is the work apt to be intellectualized, but all too often it is based on inaccurate data supplied by the patient. The here and now offers a far better way to work. The general strategy is to find a here and now equivalent of the dysfunctional interaction. Once this is done, the work becomes much more accurate and immediate. Some examples: Keith and permanent grudges. Keith, a long-term patient and a practicing psychotherapist, reported a highly vitriolic interaction with his adult son. The son, for the first time, had decided to make the arrangements for the family's annual fishing and camping trip. Though pleased at his son's coming of age and at being relieved of the burden, Keith could not relinquish control, and when he attempted to override his son's planning by forcefully insisting upon a slightly earlier date and different locale, his son exploded, calling his father intrusive and controlling. Keith was devastated and absolutely convinced that he had permanently lost his son's love and respect. What are my tasks in this situation? A long-range task, to which we would return in the future, was to explore Keith's inability to relinquish control. A more immediate task was to offer some immediate comfort and assist Keith to reestablish equilibrium. I sought to help Keith gain perspective so that he could understand that this contretemps was but one fleeting episode against the horizon of a lifetime of loving interactions with his son. I deemed it inefficient for me to analyze in great and endless depth this episode between Keith and his son, whom I had never met and whose true feelings I could only surmise. Far better, I thought, to identify and work through a here and now equivalent of the unsettling event. But what here and now event? That's where rabbit ears are needed. As it happened, I had recently referred to Keith a patient who, after a couple of sessions with him, did not return. Keith had experienced great anxiety about losing this patient and agonized for a long time before, quote unquote, confessing it in the previous session. Keith was convinced that I would judge him harshly, that I would not forgive him for failing, and that I would never again refer another patient to him. Note the symbolic equivalence of these two events. In each one, Keith presumed that a single act would forever blemish him in the eyes of someone he treasured. I chose to pursue the here and now episode because of its greater immediacy and accuracy. I was the subject of Keith's apprehension and could access my own feelings rather than be limited to conjecture about how his son felt. I told him that he was misreading me entirely, that I had no doubts about his sensitivity and compassion, and was certain that he did excellent clinical work. It was unthinkable for me to ignore all my long experience with him on the basis of this one episode, and I said that I would refer him other patients in the future. In the final analysis, I feel certain that this here and now therapeutic work was far more powerful than a then and there investigation of the crisis with his son, and that he would remember our encounter long after he forgot any intellectual analysis of the episode with his son. Alice and crudity. Alice, a 60-year-old widow desperately searching for another husband, complained of a series of failed relationships with men who often vanished without explanation from her life. In our third month of therapy, she took a cruise with her latest beau, Morris, who expressed his chagrin at her haggling over prices, shamelessly pushing her way to the front of lines and sprinting for the best seats in tour buses. After their trip, Morris disappeared and refused to return her calls. Rather than embark on an analysis of her relationship with Morris, I turned to my own relationship with Alice. I was aware that I too wanted out and had pleasurable fantasies in which she announced she had decided to terminate. Even though she brashly and successfully negotiated a considerably lower therapy fee, she continued to tell me how unfair it was that I should charge her so much. She never failed to make some comment on the fee, about whether I had earned it that day, or about my unwillingness to give her an even lower senior citizen fee. Moreover, she pressed for extra time by bringing up urgent issues just as the hour was ending, or giving me items to read, on your own time, as she put it. Her dream journal, articles on widowhood, journaling therapy, or the fallacy of Freud's beliefs. Overall, she was without delicacy, and just as she had done with Morris, turned our relationship into something crude. I knew that this here and now reality was where we needed to work, and the gentle exploration of how she had coarsened her relationship with me proved so useful that months later some very astonished elderly gentleman received her phone calls of apology. Mildred and the lack of presence. Mildred had been abused sexually as a child and had such difficulty in her physical relationship with her husband that her marriage was in jeopardy. As soon as her husband touched her sexually, she began to re experience traumatic events from her past. This paradigm made it very difficult to work on her relationship to her husband because it demanded that she first be liberated from the past, a daunting process. As I examined the here and now relationship between the two of us, I could appreciate many similarities between the way she related to me and the way she related to her husband. I often felt ignored in the sessions. Though she was an engaging storyteller and had the capacity to entertain me at great length, I found it difficult to be quote unquote present with her, that is, linked, engaged, close to her, with some sense of mutuality. She rambled, never asked me about myself, appeared to have little sense or curiosity about my experience in the hour, was never quote unquote there relating to me. Gradually, as I persisted in focusing on the quote unquote in betweenness of our relationship and the extent of her absence and how shut out I felt by her, Mildred began to appreciate the extent to which she exiled her husband. And one day she started a session by saying, "For some reason, I'm not sure why, I've just made a great discovery. I never look my husband in the eyes when we have sex." Albert and swallowed rage. Albert, who commuted over an hour to my office, had often experienced panic at times when he felt he had been exploited. He knew he was suffused with anger, but could find no way to express it. In one session, he described a frustrating encounter with a girlfriend who, in his view, was obviously jerking him around, yet he was paralyzed with fear about confronting her. The session felt repetitious to me. We had spent considerable time in many sessions discussing the same material, and I always felt I had offered him little help. I could sense his frustration with me. He implied that he had spoken to many friends who had covered all the same bases I had, and had ultimately advised him to tell her off or get out of the relationship. I tried to speak for him. "Albert, let me see if I can guess at what you might be experiencing in this session. You travel an hour to see me, and you pay me a good deal of money, yet we seem to be repeating ourselves. You feel I don't give you much of value. I say the same things as your friends who give it to you free. You have got to be disappointed in me, even feeling ripped off and angry at me for giving you so little." He gave a thin smile and acknowledged that my assessment was fairly accurate. I was pretty close. I asked him to repeat it in his own words. He did that with some trepidation, and I responded that, though I couldn't be happy with not having given him what he wanted, I liked very much his stating these things directly to me. It felt better to be straighter with each other, and he had been indirectly conveying these sentiments anyway. The whole interchange proved useful to Albert. His feelings toward me were an analogue of his feelings toward his girlfriend, and the experience of expressing them without a calamitous outcome was powerfully instructive. Chapter 18. Working Through Issues in the Here and Now. So far, we have considered how to recognize patients' major problems in the here and now. But once that is accomplished, how then do we proceed? How can we use these here and now observations in the work of therapy? Example: return to the scene I described earlier, the screen door with the faulty latch, and my patient who fiddled with it every week and always apologized too many times for not being able to close the door. Nancy, I said, I'm curious about your apologizing to me. It's as though my broken door and my laxity in getting it fixed is somehow your fault. You're right, I know that, and yet I keep on doing it. Any hunches about why? I think it's got to do with how important you are and how important therapy is to me and my wanting to make sure I don't offend you in any way. Nancy, can you take a guess about how I feel every time you apologize? It's probably irritating for you. I nod. I can't deny it, but you're quick to say that as though it's a familiar experience to you. Is there a history to this? I've heard it before many times, she says. I can tell you it drives my husband crazy. I know I irritate a lot of people, and yet I keep doing it. So, in the guise of apologizing and being polite, you end up irritating others. Moreover, even though you know that, you still have difficulty in stopping. There must be some kind of payoff for you. I wonder, what is it? That interview and subsequent sessions then took off in a number of fruitful directions, particularly in the area of her rage toward everyone, her husband, parents, children, and me. Fastidious in her habits, she revealed how unnerved the faulty screen door made her, and not only the door, but also my cluttered desk, heaped high with untidy stacks of books. She also stated how very impatient she was with me for not working faster with her. Example: several months into therapy, Louise, a patient who is highly critical of me, of the office furnishings, the poor color scheme, the general untidiness of my desk, my clothing, the informality and incompleteness of my bills, told me about a new romantic relationship she had formed. During the course of her account, she remarked, well, grudgingly, I have to admit I'm doing better. I'm struck by your word grudgingly. Why grudgingly? It seems hard for you to say positive things about me and about our work together. What do you know about that? No answer. Louise silently shook her head. Just think out loud, Louise. Anything that comes to mind. Well, you'll get a swelled head. Can't have that. Keep going. You'll win, I'll lose. Win and lose. We're in a battle? And what's the battle about? And the underlying war? Don't know, just a part of me that's always been there. Always mocking people, looking for their bad side, seeing them sitting on a pile of their own shit. And with me, I'm thinking of how critical you are of my office, and of the path as well. You never fail to mention the mud, but never the flowers blossoming. Happens with my boyfriend all the time. He'll bring me presents, and I can't help focusing on how little care he has taken with the wrapping. We got in a fight last week when he baked me a loaf of bread, and I made a teasing comment on the slightly burnt corner of the crust. You always give that side of you a voice, and you keep the other side mute, the side that appreciates his making you bread, the side that likes and values me. Louise, go back to the beginning of this discussion, your comment about grudgingly admitting you are better. Tell me, what would it be like if you were to unfetter the positive part of you and speak straight out without the grudgingly? I see sharks circling. Just think of speaking to me. What do you imagine? Kissing you on the lips? For several sessions thereafter, we explored her fears of closeness, of wanting too much, of unfilled, insatiable yearnings, of her love for her father, and her fears that I would bolt if I really knew how much she wanted from me. Note in this vignette that I drew upon incidents that had occurred in the past, earlier in our therapy. Here and now work is not strictly ahistoric, since it may include any events that have occurred throughout one's relationship with the patient. As Sartre put it, introspection is always retrospection. Chapter 19. The here and now energizes therapy. Work in the here and now is always more exciting than work with a more abstract or historical focus. This is particularly evident in group therapy. Consider, for example, an historical episode in group work. In 1946, the state of Connecticut sponsored a workshop to deal with racial tensions in the workplace. Small groups led by the eminent psychologist Kurt Lewin and a team of social psychologists engaged in a discussion of the back home problems brought up by the participants. The leaders and observers of the groups, without the group members, held nightly post group meetings in which they discussed not only the content, but also the process of the sessions. Nota bene, the content refers to the actual words and concepts expressed. The process refers to the nature of the relationship between the individuals who express the words and concepts. News spread about these evening staff meetings, and 2 days later, the members of the groups asked to attend. After much hesitation, such a procedure was entirely novel, approval was granted, and the group members observed themselves being discussed by the leaders and researchers. There are several published accounts of this momentous session at which the importance of the here and now was discovered. All agree that the meeting was electrifying. Members were fascinated by hearing themselves and their behavior discussed. Soon they could stay silent no longer and interjected such comments as, "No, that wasn't what I said," or "how I said it," or "what I meant." The social scientists realized that they had stumbled onto an important axiom for education and for therapy as well, namely that we learn best about ourselves and our behavior through personal participation in interaction, combined with observation and analysis of that interaction. In group therapy, the difference between a group discussing back home problems of the members and a group engaged in the here and now, that is, a discussion of their own process, is very evident. The here and now group is energized, members are engaged, and they will always, if questioned, either through interviews or research instruments, remark that the group comes alive when it focuses on process. In the 2-week group laboratories held for decades at Bethel, Maine, it was soon evident to all that the power and allure of process groups, first called sensitivity training groups, that is, interpersonal sensitivity, and later T groups, T for training, and still later encounter groups, Carl Rogers' term, immediately dwarfed other groups the laboratory offered, for example, theory groups, application groups, or problem solving groups, in terms of members' interest and enthusiasm. In fact, it was often said that the T groups ate up the rest of the laboratory. People want to interact with others, are excited by giving and receiving direct feedback, yearn to learn how they are perceived by others, want to slough off their facades and become intimate. Many years ago, when I was attempting to develop a more effective mode to lead brief therapy groups on the acute inpatient ward, I visited dozens of groups in hospitals throughout the country and found every group to be ineffective, and for precisely the same reason. Each group meeting used a take turns or check in format consisting of members sequentially discussing some then and there event. For example, hallucinatory experiences, or past suicidal inclinations, or the reasons for their hospitalization, while the other members listened silently and often disinterestedly. I ultimately formulated, in a text on inpatient group therapy, a here and now approach for such acutely disturbed patients, which I believe vastly increased the degree of member engagement. A here and now approach for such acutely disturbed patients, which I believe vastly increased the degree of member engagement. The same observation holds for individual therapy. Therapy is invariably energized when it focuses on the relationship between therapist and patient. Every Day Gets a Little Closer describes an experiment in which a patient and I each wrote summaries of the therapy hour. It was striking that whenever we read and discussed each other's observations, that is, whenever we focused on the here and now, the ensuing therapy sessions came alive. Chapter 20. Use your own feelings as data. One of our major tasks in therapy is to pay attention to our immediate feelings. They represent precious data. If in the session you feel bored or irritated, confused, sexually aroused, or shut out by your patient, then regard that as valuable information. This is precisely why I so emphasize personal therapy for therapists. If you develop a deep knowledge of yourself, eliminate the majority of your blind spots, and have a good base of patient experience, You will begin to know how much of the boredom or confusion is yours and how much is evoked by the patient. It is important to make that distinction because if it is the patient who evokes your boredom in the therapy hour, then we may confidently assume that he is boring to others in other settings. So rather than be dismayed at boredom, welcome it and search for a way to turn it to therapeutic advantage. When did it begin? What exactly does the patient do that bores you? When I encounter boredom, I might say something like this: Mary, let me tell you something. For the last several minutes, I notice that I've been feeling disconnected from you, somewhat distanced. I'm not sure why, but I know I'm feeling different now than at the beginning of the session when you were describing your feelings of not having gotten what you wanted from me, or the last session when you spoke more from the heart. I wonder, what is your level of connection to me today? Is your feeling similar to mine? Let's try to understand what's happening. Some years ago, I treated Martin, a successful merchant who had to take a business trip on the day of therapy, and asked me to reschedule his hour to another day in the week. I couldn't arrange this without inconveniencing my schedule and told Martin we'd have to miss the session and meet at our regular hour the following week. But later, as I thought about it, I realized I would not have hesitated to rearrange my schedule for any of my other patients. Why couldn't I do this for Martin? It was because I did not look forward to seeing him. There was something about his mean-spiritedness that had worn me down. He was unceasingly critical of me, my office furniture, the lack of parking, my secretary, my fee, and generally began sessions by referring to my errors of the previous week. My feeling worn down by Martin had vast implications. He had initially entered therapy because of a series of failed relationships with women, none of whom he thought had ever given him enough. None was sufficiently forthcoming with her proper share of restaurant or grocery bills or birthday gifts, equivalent in value to the ones he had given to them. His income, mind you, was several times greater than theirs. When they took trips together, he insisted that they each put the same amount of cash into a quote unquote travel jar, and all traveling expenses, including gasoline, parking, car maintenance, tips, even newspapers, be paid for out of travel jar cash. Furthermore, he groused often because his girlfriends did not do their full share of driving, trip planning, or map reading. Eventually, Martin's lack of generosity, his obsession with absolute fairness, and his relentless criticism wore out the women in his life, and he was doing exactly the same to me. It was a good example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. He so dreaded being uncared for that his behavior brought that very thing to pass. It was my recognition of this process that permitted me to avoid responding critically, that is, take it personally, but to realize this was a pattern that he had repeated many times and that he at bottom wanted to change.